Maltodextrin or glucose syrup? Which one should you use in your gelato or ice cream? And what about corn syrup or tapioca syrup? Let's try to clear things up and start from the beginning. Welcome to this new video of the Gelato.expert Academy. I'm Luca Musolesi and today I want to discuss and test some ingredients that are very common in gelato and ice cream, glucose syrups. Glucose syrups is a big category of product derived from starch and that can get different names depending on their processing and their origin. Glucose syrups are produced from starch, which is most commonly corn starch, and for this reason, especially in the US, are often called corn syrups. However, they can be produced also from potato starch or even tapioca starch. So you can see sometimes also the name tapioca syrup, and it is generally just a glucose syrup produced from tapioca starch. Then, as the name says, glucose syrup usually contain a part of water and they are therefore syrups. Nowadays, it's also very common to find them dehydrated in form of powder because it's easier to store and use. In this case, they are called dry glucose syrups or dehydrated glucose syrups or similar names. Finally, there is an important parameter that defines glucose syrups, the so-called dextrose equivalent or DE. This is a number that represents the amount of reducing sugar compared to dextrose and therefore gives an indication of the average degree of polymerization of the carbohydrates present in the glucose syrup. This number is always referred to the dry part of the glucose syrup. In very simple words, we can say that the closer the DE is to 0, the closer we are to starch, while the closer we get to 100, the closer we are to dextrose. As an arbitrary convention, glucose syrups with a DE number below 20 are called maltodextrins. It's important to remember that two glucose syrups with the same DE number can have very different mixes of carbohydrates, so also different sweetness and behavior, depending on the production process and the company making them. But what we want to test in this video is how important it is the DE number in gelato, and what are the differences if we use one or another product. To try to give an answer to this question, I collected a few different types of maltodextrins and glucose syrups from different producers and with different values of dextrose equivalence. We have here our standard gelato recipe and we are going to use 12% of sucrose, 2% of dextrose and 5% of maltodextrin or dry glucose syrup. When we test the liquid glucose syrup, we will use 6% instead of 5% to account for the water content, so we will have the same amount of glucose syrup solids. For our test, we have a maltodextrin at 12 DE and one at 19 DE. Then we move up to a dry glucose syrup at 29 DE, one at 39 DE, and finally a liquid glucose syrup at 42-44 DE. We are basically covering the range of most common products available on the market, and using 5% in our recipe we can definitely appreciate the differences. Now we are going to prepare these mixes, freeze them, and then we can perform some tests and tasting, obviously. As always, what we can measure is the overrun just out of the batch freezer, and then we will blast chill the samples, and after 24 hours we will measure the hardness and make a sensory evaluation to see what are the differences in flavor and texture. Finally, we can repeat the hardness measurement and the sensory evaluation after 72 hours, and the last test we can perform is a melting analysis. Now let's have a quick overview of the recipes and their parameters, like the freezing point and the sugar content, and then we will move to prepare them. Okay, let's have a look at the recipe that we will use to test the different types of glucose syrups and maltodextrin. So here we have our usual standard recipe with milk, cream, sucrose, dextrose, maltodextrin or glucose syrups, depending on what we are testing, skim milk powder and a standard stabilizer for gelato. In terms of parameters, we always have our around 9% of total fat and a little bit less than 25% of formulation sugars, which include the lactose, of course. If we see the first test that we are going to do with maltodextrin, 12 and then 19 and then glucose syrup, they will all have the same recipe except the one with the liquid glucose syrup, because it contains water, so we will reduce the amount of milk, that is the main source of water, and increase a little bit the amount of glucose syrup. But for the dry products, we will always use the same recipe, so we can compare how they are different used in the same quantity. In terms of freezing point, we see in the first recipe we are around minus 2.7, so pretty much a standard recipe. And then we can see that going up from the 12 DE maltodextrin, we will go up to the 19 DE, and the freezing point just slightly decreases. And then we go to dry glucose syrup 29 DE, and here also we have a change in the freezing point and possibly also a change in the sweetness, or at least in what is the theoretical sweetness. Then we go to a higher dry glucose syrup, and again we lower again the freezing point up to minus 3 degrees Celsius, and we possibly increase the sweetness, at least in theory. And finally, with the glucose syrup liquid, we will use 6% and just remove 1% of milk, so we have the same amount of basically glucose syrup solids in our recipe. And also here we have a slightly decrease in the freezing point, possibly also different sweetness. Let's see. They are all different manufacturers, so they have also different production methods and actual content of sugars and other carbohydrates inside. Now let's prepare the samples and see how they perform and how they taste. We have now prepared and freezed our 5 samples with different types of maltodextrin and glucose syrups, and we have done all the measurements and the tasting, of course. So let's see what are the results of these tests. All these samples, they were extracted at -7 from the batch freezer, and then we measured the overrun, and after that we packed them and put it in the blast chiller at -24, and then in the storage freezer for 24 hours at -18 with an actual temperature of the gelato when we perform the test of -17. So the first measurement is of course the overrun, and we can see that the overrun is very comparable among all the tests. Maybe it's a bit lower in the first sample with the maltodextrin 12 DE, but for the others we are in the range of the measurement error, so we cannot really see there is a big difference between the 4 samples except for the first one. Then we measure the hardness, and you can see also here that except for the last sample that seems to be a little bit softer after 24 hours, the first 4 samples are really similar to each other. Maybe the first is slightly harder, but we are still in the measurement errors, so they could be all the same eventually. After 24 hours, they are all very comparable, except for the last one that is a little bit softer. After 72 hours, however, we see an interesting phenomenon. We see that the first 2 samples, the one with the 2 types of maltodextrin, are quite a bit harder than the other 3 samples, while the other 3 samples, they are pretty much the same or very comparable to each other. So we just see this disparity in the maltodextrin arriving until the 19 DE, and then starting from the 29 we see comparable measurements. In terms of melting analysis, there are no significant differences in the shape retention. However, there is a slight difference in the melting rate only for the last sample with the liquid glucose syrup, which melts at a slightly higher rate. In terms of flavor and sweetness, they are all pretty much identical after 24 hours. Just maybe the last sample feels slightly sweeter, but not a lot. After 72 hours, the sweetness is kind of disappeared, so they all taste more or less the same. except that maybe the first one, the one with maltodextrin 12DE, is slightly chewer and slower to melt in the mouth. But for the rest, in terms of flavor, we don't really see many differences between the 5 samples. So what do these tests teach us? They tell us something that is not that obvious, but that in gelato, even at fairly high quantities, the differences between maltodextrin and different types of glucose syrups are very, very minimal. And it also tells us that if we are making our own recipe, it doesn't make sense to use in combination a maltodextrin and a glucose syrup, because they have pretty much the same behavior, very mild differences maybe in sweetness, but not really perceivable at the standard amounts that we use of these ingredients in our gelato. So basically the choice between one and the other is given by the price in the location where we are. Then of course, in case we are making some product that is more specific or industrial, it might make sense to combine a low DE number and a high DE number in case we want some specific chewability, some specific characteristics in terms of hardness, but at the same time we want a certain amount of solids. But for 90% of people, it makes no sense to combine different glucose syrups and or maltodextrin, because they have very, very comparable results, no matter what you're using from what company and what DE number. This is of course when we are talking about DE number below 42, 44. We are not talking about fructose, glucose syrups that are different and that have a very different composition, or not about glucose syrups that have a DE number higher than 60, where we have a much higher content of sugars. So this is a very useful information, and we can balance what we want to use for our recipes depending also on the price and availability that we have locally. If you have more questions and you want me to test more things regarding glucose syrups or maltodextrin, just write down in the comments your problem or your questions, and I will try to answer or make some new tests. If you like this video and you want to see more like this, like and subscribe to our channel. And if you want to learn more about other sugars and their use in gelato, check out our full online course at the Gelato.expert Academy, link in the description. For now, that's all. See you in the next video.